Well, hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to Microdose's Indigenous Peoples Day kind of discussion and celebration. My name is Stephen Huang. I'm the founder of Millennial HR Design, a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy focused on the psychedelic space. And I have with me two of my friends and peers, Matthew Yazzie and Sandor Iron Rope. Before we jump into it, Matthew and Sandor, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the folks joining us for this LinkedIn Live today. Feel free to share as much or as little as you'd like. Matt, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Matthew Yazzie. I am Native American, Indigenous Navajo Dene tribe. I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in Northwest New Mexico and made my way eventually out to California, where I loved the area so much. I eventually made it my home for the past, 20 years now. I am currently the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Programming for Women 2.0. And I also am a strategic director for a collective group of DEI professionals here based out of the Bay Area. My background is specifically been in tech and policy, but right now I'm specifically an organizational and behavioral scientist that works specifically on workplace trauma, harassment, and discrimination in workplaces. So I try to reduce the amount of harm that I think a lot of companies end up putting on their employees as they work and go on with their day-to-day lives and trying to show up to work and navigate those situations. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to chat with both of you about a lot of things today. Sandor?
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Sandor Iron Rope. I'm Ogallala Sioux, Teton Lakota, residing here in the Black Hills of South Dakota. My work is in primarily conservation currently. I'm a board of directors member from the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. This platform of psychedelics has brought indigenous perspectives into the light a little bit because of entheogens, and I'm new to kind of this whole realm of sharing. But in order for people to learn and respect indigenous views and culture, we have to be able to share a little bit about our thoughts and concerns. So this has brought me here to the platform. I'm also the executive director of a family healing center. It's Lakota-based, Tiognaka Tawaka Otokai, which is translated to the beginning of a sacred home, because everything that we are supposed to learn comes from a home. And as you know, a lot of trauma has been our issues. So rebuilding a home, sharing different perspectives, cultural views, stories from the home, or what would have come from the home, is our view. Indigenous Peyote conservation has allowed me to create a platform of sovereignty for Native American church members in light of the peyote sacrament and medicine. So I've been blessed to be able to do that. I'm also a part of our ceremonial organization and leadership here on the Pine Ridge Reservation here. So welcome to our perspectives here today. Matthew and Stephen, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sandor, and thank you, Matthew. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on Ramaytush, Ohlone, and Muwekma land that is now called the Bay Area. And I don't always start with a land acknowledgement, but I think on a day like this, when we're centering indigeneity and talking about resiliency, there's a lot of reasons to think about the land that you're on, who was on that land before, and to think about their cultures, their views, and their traditions. This is the first time that our president of the United States has acknowledged Indigenous Peoples Day. And even though different cities and states have been acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day really since, I think 1990 was the first year that I can't remember which city it was. Do either of you two remember? I'll have to look at my notes. but it's becoming more and more popular. And I think that's really a celebration. And I kind of wanted to start the day by talking about ways that we can celebrate Indigenous culture. Maybe I'll start with you, Sandor. How are you celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day today? Oh, and you are on mute.
Well, I think celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, originally, I'm also a board member of the Black Hills Powwow Association. Our event was supposed to be this weekend, and due to the variant, we've postponed, canceled this year's event. It's a big event, a big venue here in the Plains area, and it's growing. It continues to grow. This year, we were supposed to be in a new arena, $1 million arena plus space here in Rapid City, South Dakota. But we do that in conjunction with Native American Day here. Native American Day was acknowledged 1990, I believe, in that time. So in acknowledging that day, we usually have our event this weekend. But I'm celebrating it today by having a little get together here at my house with some relatives that I hardly see. So we're gathering here and celebrating, and we're planning a little ceremony. So it's good to visit people that you normally haven't for a long time. So yeah, I mean, that's just a little bit of what I'm doing today. Normally we would be swamped with people from all over the four winds, celebrating powwow in a powwow fashion arena. We call it Hesapa Wachipi na Oshkate. We will have it hopefully, prayerfully, next year. So yeah, that's what I'm doing today here.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, so this weekend I took part in a couple of small circles where we were talking about specifically residential school trauma, and gathering individuals across different communities to discuss that leading up to today. Because my work generally tends to fall within tech, we have a small little gathering that we're doing together later today, where we're just going to call, talk, support, celebrate each other. And then sometime today, I'm going to make my way down in San Francisco. There's a little art festival where a lot of Indigenous artists are putting together some things too. So I'm going to be taking a path down there. For most holidays, and this is a me personally specific thing, I tend to look at like my birthday, for example. On my birthday itself, I never have an event because I just feel like it's a reflective time for me. And so with days like this, I tend to be more self-reflective as opposed to gathering together, because, I think Indigenous Peoples Day is every day for us, and just showing up is the win right now. And I think the way that we come together as community, though, and the way that we are reminded how intrinsically connected we are together and to the world itself makes me feel great. And having that reflective moment really does shine in these experiences. And I don't think there's one way that's better or worse than the other to approach this. But I do think I'm very proud of my Indigenous heritage, and being able to celebrate in our own ways has always been something that I found strength in particular in the Bay Area as well, with the Indigenous communities here. So that's what I'll be doing today.
Lovely. And if you're willing to bring a friend along, I would love to go with you.
Yeah, sure. If my friends, for all my San Francisco friends, if you're willing to walk the 4 blocks down to Yerba Buena Plaza, I'm happy to bring you along.
That sounds lovely. And when we were talking about what we wanted to chat about with today, I didn't want to focus too much on some of the normal, kind of threads of discussion that we are talking about with Indigenous peoples, which is genocide, which is residential schools and trauma. I thought today actually would be a nice way to help shape people's narratives in celebrating Indigenous culture. Like I think Indigenous Peoples Day, and often with these kind of affinity months or days where we're celebrating different identities, is to also recognize that there are beautiful cultures and authors and brands and foods that really like bring every culture to life, and that's really what I think is worth celebrating. Another thing that I heard from you too is this concept of like resiliency. And I think that is something that Indigenous people, that when I speak to them, they really bring up. You're still here. Can both of you speak to like how you think about resiliency on a day like today? Sandor, do you want to go first?
I just wanted to also in this celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day or Native American Day, wherever you're at, is to really acknowledge our Indigenous people that are in these leadership positions. We've come a long ways in that, and being a leader, isn't always roses. And so there are a lot of women leaders, a lot of male leaders that allow a platform for our voice to be heard. And I'm also acknowledging all of our Indigenous doctors, lawyers, our people that are helping our people heal. We have a lot of healing to do. And so reflecting on Indigenous Peoples Day, there are a lot of educators out there, in the fight for Indigenous history. The curriculum is getting smaller and smaller, and U.S. history is the only thing being told. But how could you tell U.S. history without Indigenous history? So there is a lot that is happening out there, and I just want to acknowledge the people that are doing that, the Indigenous people. I have a niece that is a doctor, an MD, out in Gordon, Nebraska. I have sisters that are registered nurses. I have a lot of friends that are attorneys, and I think that that sacrifice alone says a lot about your willingness to continue our healing journey as Indigenous people, because there's voices that need to be heard on all platforms. So, resiliency, I always reflect, I always will reflect on my bloodline as a Lakota. And part of my mom's side of my history comes from Haihawk, which is Chetanwakatuye, Minikoju. And one of our grandpas was part of the Wounded Knee massacre that didn't make it. And so, coming from a little bit of that bloodline on my mom's side, resiliency, we have a lot of work to do. And you're right, not making it, the general of genocide and historical trauma, etc., etc. But, when we think about the Indigenous Day, there's, I think of all of us being here together in a big circle, holding hands with everybody, and having this vision of good health and healing as a whole Indigenous community. I mean, Mitakuye Oyase is our philosophy that means that we're all related. We're all related. The Lakota worldview of all related, and so I do have a lot of friends that are non-native, a lot of Mexican American friends and Mexican friends from old Mexico. I mean, and our unity is prayer, our unity is healing, our unity is the same concept of wanting happiness, wanting healing, and that's just human nature. And so when we focus on that unity, as Indigenous people, I have a lot of gratitude for my life and my trials and tribulations as a Lakota person. And I will continue to nurture, that understanding that we have as Indigenous people, are learning, because learning is an everyday opportunity, for each and every one of us. It's just a matter of willingness to listen. And so my concept is to really finding those people that want to listen, non-Indigenous people that want to listen and share our concept, and try to find that balance of it. Resiliency. We are here. I know that my mom and dad were they didn't get to see the luxuries of religious freedom of 1978. They didn't get to see the luxuries of even the amendments of 94. And my dad was a veteran of the Korean conflict. My uncle was a veteran of World War II. You have a lot of indigenous, warrior societies that have been a part of, the creating and protecting of the United States of America. And of course, the code talkers, the Navajo code talkers are known quite well. There are different tribes that were code talkers and etc. So when you think of resiliency, you think of the whole history of the United States. You think of our participation in protecting and preserving this land, America. And you look at us today, trying to find that balance of understanding and healing, as a family, as a community, and as a nation. Just my thoughts here today, a little bit on that resiliency.
Thank you.
Yeah, you look at most indigenous groups in the United States, and you speak to this group, you're always going to find some commonalities. One, the self-definition that the groups give themselves in terms of how they define their worldview, very uniquely to their environment and to others. And two, there's also for my tribe, the Dene people, we have a concept. We call something hajone, which means like it's this completed circle, or it represents balance and beauty, and it does sort of, from a young age, you're taught and ingrained sort of with these topics of engaging with each other in these broad, meaningful ways. And so when we look at different aspects of the indigenous experience in the United States, we oftentimes bifurcate what that means. And we want to say that, when we look at the trauma, we also are trying to balance that out with other things. But at the same time, the two things don't live without each other at the same time. And so with I know a lot of individuals, to Sandor's point around religious freedom, individuals who were taken out of their families and then raised in a different religion, and that's impacted how they're trying to come to terms now with balancing what they were taught growing up versus what they feel has been more traditional, or what's been left behind in a lot of times. And so that inner conflict oftentimes can manifest itself as a lot of trauma in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways, people look at the balance of that, also understanding, like, I'm coming to terms with something that has been intrinsically true for myself for my entire life. And so we see these patterns emerge oftentimes. And when we look at leadership as well, in terms of policy and stuff, we're like, for the first time, and this is kind of sad, right? Like, for the first time, we're seeing indigenous women being involved in government. And given that specifically federal government, but given that a number of indigenous communities are matriarchal, it's the exact opposite of how we've seen women in leadership roles. And so there's a lot of reconciliation in trying to balance out things that we grow up with that have been normalized from a westernized perspective, but also the complexity of celebrating that within the trauma itself. And so oftentimes when we're trying to separate out the two, it is difficult to talk about one without really recognizing the other, if not necessarily focusing on it. And so and I think that that's what's great about the indigenous community, is that we oftentimes we're not a monolith. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, literally hundreds of different distinct tribes that made themselves up in the United States. But at the same time, we all kind of have this shared experience across the board about how others have tried to shape our narrative. And so those narratives can shift, but we oftentimes find community in those differences. And we also find struggle within those differences as well. So I know Sandor would probably be the first, as well as I will be the first, to say our experiences reflect only one small subset of experiences from a number of different tribes that grew up on the reservation, that grew up in cities, that grew up in the Southwest, that grew up in the Mid-Atlantic states. So it's a complex conversation to have, but we have to start having them. And I think that right now it's great to start seeing more individuals, particularly in social media, people sharing different things about their stories being embraced, when in the past it was almost looked as a shameful thing to talk about.
Thank you. And I feel that sometimes in the psychedelic space, often indigenous reciprocity is thought of as like this thing that folks need to do. And what I'm hearing, maybe in subtext, is a lot of romanticized versions of all of these tribes, like all use certain psychedelics. So they all have these certain traditions. And that's incorrect. Like you said, hundreds of different tribes with different practices and traditions and relationships with the land, because it's, all over the place. Do you think, I'm kind of curious, and I want to give you a chance to highlight aspects of your own tribe or culture. What sort of, what aspects or teachings did you learn as a kid that you wish like America and the federal government would start to think and adopt? Another way I could think of this question is, if there were more indigenous people in the federal government beyond just, the Secretary of the Interior, how do you think the federal government might be a little bit different?
I think, it's a great question. I think one, across the board, just the lending a different lens of experiences to individuals would help, I think, in terms of policy, because we're looking at privilege when we look at what government, most people in government positions are in a position of privilege. You look at the makeup of the Senate, for example, the House barely getting Native women leadership. We don't have those perspectives even in the room. So clearly laws and policies aren't necessarily, they're being made on behalf of these individuals, of the constituents that these individuals serve, but they're not being made for those people. And the fact that people aren't necessarily embracing these narratives oftentimes can be, very problematic in terms of like, are we actually serving the entire community as a whole? I think there are different aspects of the indigenous experience where we do have different in terms of sovereignty rights, land rights, mineral rights, different various aspects about our self-governance that I think are really intrinsically tied to just how this country functions on a federal level. But even on a more local level, how do these communities also engage for those resources from a state, from a county level as well? Again, we don't see necessarily enough, I think, indigenous native people taking leadership positions to begin shifting that. And so just having those voices represented to say, like, not the entire United States, has access to running water or electricity, for example, but that also hits parts of South Side Chicago where, there are some communities that don't have access to running water. Flint, Michigan, no access to clean running water. Like we think of these things specifically as maybe indigenous problems, but they also affect other underrepresented and marginalized communities in the United States. So I think having these individuals sort of serve in these positions just broadens the reach across the board about the type of problems that actually exist within the country itself. And then also I think there is just, when I look at my experience growing up, just again looking at those at Nijoni, these terms that mean balance and beauty, they're set in stone with you at a very, very young age. and engaging with each other in these sort of more respectful ways. I think I can't not be that. That is a fundamental part of how I exist and how I see the world and how I relate to the world and to other communities. And so I think and I talk to other individuals who even in the yeah I talk to other individuals, peers, friends of mine, and I'm talking about their families and their first cousins. And I know all 48 of my first cousins by first name, and I grew up with a good third of them like living in my backyard or living with each other. And so the sense of family that I have is very different, and how I engage with family is very different, and how I think about community is very different. And even extended family and those relationships that extend beyond just your blood relatives, but also your clanships and other historical sort of families that your families have also made. Like it just expands out. And I don't think it's something that's hard for me to talk about, because I don't think you can get it unless you've actually it's just such, it's who you are. It is a part of your life. It's like me describing how it is just to be human, like that. It's just an intrinsic part of my system of beliefs. So, but I think having that and having more people kind of come to terms with that, and even when there's disagreement and misunderstandings, I think having individuals who come at it with a perspective that is a bit more communal would probably do the government just in general like a whole lot more good, in terms of just getting us to a better place sooner rather than later.
I love that. Amazing answer. Sandor, what about you?
Yeah, I would just echo a lot what Matthew said. I mean, because you're coming from different social, economical status and your privileged status. And, I grew up on and off the reservation, no running water. I know a lot of my Diné relatives have the same issues. And, going outside to play and coming back at dark time was the norm. And I have grandchildren today that go outside and play. I mean, child development is really essential in the beginning stages of language, how they view the world, and being outside playing versus having a little video screen in front of you. There's going to be a lot of you know development issues if you have a screen in your face all the time. you know but looking at the differences, and then government, government here on our reservations, the IRA, Indian Renewal Act, 1934 or somewhere around there. We have indigenous folks introduced to this form of government. In our traditional perspective, we are council form, and so now you have a Western concept introduced to us in the form of government, which conflicts a little bit with our traditional views. So now, how do we go about those things? And it's been a challenge since its onset. To really balance the resources that the federal, we're quasi sovereign. We're not fully sovereign. We're quasi sovereign. So we get federal funding, but now balancing that issue is a challenge today with our tribal government system. Balancing it, and I think that women are underserved. Women bring a feminine strength that maybe not all government systems are used to. But when you're in a home, and if your mom or your auntie or your grandma says something, that's the law. I mean, and you don't question it, okay? And you may not like it, but you're going to accept it. So there's just little things that happen from an indigenous perspective that you grow up with, and yeah, like a little bit what Matthew said. I don't want to explain it because you're not going to get the whole thing, but we can try to share a little bit of it, because having nothing to having something, where we're striving for the bare essentials of survival, you know, running clean water, go get your wood, chop your own wood. Don't just turn the thermostat to 70 or 75. You're going to go get your own wood, and actually hunting for your food, a different concept that still happens today. When COVID hit and the freezers and the stores shut down, everybody said, "Oh no, we don't have no more meat." What happened to your hunting skills? You know, so just small things that we as indigenous people still practice that may be overlooked, but if you do have some of those basic skills, it gives you a different perspective and how you would run things, or, put resources here and resources there, But I think getting outside and realizing the season to season responsibilities, because every season comes with preparations, no matter who you are and what tribe that you are, you prepare for that next season. And having that concept in mind in government may help a little bit. There's a lot of things that may help, but I don't know if it would fall on deaf ears or not.
I loved what Sandor said right there, exactly, because I think there is um, growing up, we learned our four cardinal directions in terms of the sacred mountains. We learned about the sun rising in the east, setting in the west. Like, so we nowadays, I can't get lost on. Plop me down anywhere, and at night I'm like, okay, here, there's there's where all the planets line up. Okay, we need to head that direction. And as kids, we just grew up with that. We just knew, like, if the moon was in a certain place, this was it. If the moon had these little wispy kind of aura around it, it was going to be really cold, or there's the potential for rain. Like, those things are things that I just know. And my friends, when I tell them this, they're like, oh my God, why didn't you talk to me about this? That's really cool. And I'm like, well, one, it's not a romanticized thing that I want to share with anyone, because, like, you have to earn knowing things about me. Like, it's just, there's not a given. And second, though, I think when you look at most research around how children are developing, and I really love that Sandor brought this up, there is a shift, I think, in also like your hippocampus, and there's like developmental things that happen physiologically when you lose the ability to set that context for yourself. So when we're relying on the phones to do the tech and the directions and to do all of that, like it impacts you. Social development, when children are not seeing faces, literal faces, it impacts how they're able to, or getting touch, or getting that sensory experience. They end up having developmental problems as they grow older and older. That causes them in their future to just lack that ability, because their neurons didn't have that at those early stages of their life. And so we look at westernized research and we're like, okay, we see these things that are sort of a given as good things, and we don't look at indigenous communities as ways, or engaging indigenous individuals as ways, as a method to as a blueprint for being able to be better. And I think that that's one of the most unfortunate kind of aspects of this is there's things that come naturally to this, and it's stuff that we don't necessarily think or even want to talk to others about sometimes, but it shouldn't be on us to have to constantly have to step in to solve those problems, because other individuals know about these issues and other individuals know about these strengths in these communities. The real problem comes is because people in leadership position, people who have privilege, don't want to give up that agency to others to help serve a greater good. That's the fundamental problem. And so what ends up happening is then the cycle continues on, where these people we end up electing their children as politicians. We end up electing their children as future presidents, right? Like, we create these dynasties that end up not breaking this cycle of systemic oppression that can exist in a lot of these ways. So that's what it starts somewhere. And I think those small, simple things that we oftentimes don't think about are sometimes the most crucial in terms of where we are headed as a society and what we need to look forward to in the future.
My mind is blown in such a good way right now. Yeah, I'm thinking about my own childhood and days that I spent camping and days that I spent in front of my TV playing video games. And, I think my parents did a pretty good balance. And I'm wondering, I've seen kids, with iPads in front of them when they're like playing on an airplane, which I actually don't mind. I'm like, please, that's not a bad place to have your kid in front of an iPad. But at restaurants and kind of everywhere now in the streets in their strollers. And when I asked that question, I was actually curious about how you're going to answer, because I think there are so many, Native and Indigenous learnings that I want to extend to everyone. And as we start to wrap up this conversation, maybe that's kind of one lightning question that I can kind of give for folks. Let me think about this. In our blueprint to be better, what is one way that not to do like ingenuity as a specimen, but what is one author or resource or just an indigenous like wisdom that someone listening today can look at today, read, listen to, watch, and try to embody and think about how they might want to spend today a little bit differently?
I think that there's a quote in a movie, which is not from an indigenous movie author, but I just love the concept of this. It's like it's a quote from a movie where the quote is only a fool looks at a finger that's pointing to the sky, right? So there are things that people can lean into in terms of educating themselves, but the true journey and the true lack of the true ignorance, I should say, that's coming from people that are trying to learn about more things and trying to educate themselves really begins with the individual understanding that journey for themselves. So what I would challenge people to do starting from today is to take whatever journey you feel is appropriate for you. I always have a difficult time maybe referencing books, for example, because there's a book called There by Tommy Orange, wrote a couple of years ago, that I find to be really fascinating. But I really but even just recommending books and things as resources oftentimes falls flat, because I think not everyone reads books. Some people watch YouTube videos, some people watch TikTok. I would say the journey really begins with finding the kind of medium that works for you, and searching, not getting fed that medium, but searching within that medium for voices that aren't like your own. And when you learn something, the one thing that I hope people take away is when they learn something, to say to themselves what they identify as. You could say, I'm a 35-year-old gay Asian male, and I didn't know that parts of the Navajo reservation, but 33% of the Navajo reservation didn't have access to clean running water and electricity. So owning those parts of your identity while connecting it to something that's the educational part isn't a self-flagellation exercise. It's a reality check for yourself. It really hones in to say, this is perhaps something that I shouldn't let another person who is like me go their entire lives without knowing. And so the journey, I think, as ultimately begins and ends with the individual. So how are we focusing the attention on the individual to own what that narrative is and what the lack of understanding is in that process? So that's my advice.
Nailed it, except that I'm 34. But so that is so spot on. Sandor?
I'd like to say Vine Deloria Jr. gives a good perspective from a time period that is changing from the 60s and 70s, about red power, about Custer dying for your sins, and giving people an introduction to, what has shaped us, so I always like Vine Deloria Jr. And something about indigenous perspective for us as Lakota people is Wableza, is to have that understanding when you don't only hear it, you have that understanding about how it works. Wableza, to notice things and to comprehend something, to that understanding, is something that we hold dear in our teachings as Lakota people, Wableza, and I could relate to a lot of what Matthew has said, because I have, tons and tons of Dene people as my relatives in clanship, but really getting a fundamental foundation for me, season to season. If you live in an urban area, I'm sure there's well, if you live in a tropical area, you're probably not going to have much seasonal change. But for me, the foundation comes in preparing for the next season. That's something that grandma and grandpa always did. We should always do that. It has a foundation to my inner spirit, season to season. And if you prepare, do some research about understanding what does that mean for you as a person, when you look at healthy generations here, we're talking about a constant, decolonized paradigm. We're talking about a constant, healing from historical trauma. That's a given. But what are you being proactive for? And I give props to all the organizations and people, like I said before, that are actually doing the work out in the field, to help those changes and help plant those seeds, because everything starts from a seed. So the indigenous perspective about seasons to season, seeds of change, seeds of spiritual hope, and I do hope that somebody does get something out of what we're sharing here, to give a little time to people. And this whole platform of social Zoom and all this is new to me, and I'm still trying to get used to it too, because sitting in front of a screen and talking and trying to dig inside myself about sharing, that's why I'm constantly looking at the trees rather than the screen. But it's a new shift for myself. But I do hope that people do be proactive in supporting indigenous organizations, indigenous led, whatever it may be, help the healing and help us all, be better than we were yesterday.
Thank you so much, Matthew and Sandor, for spending some time on Indigenous Peoples Day with me. I am a monthly contributor to IPCI, so that is one way that you can help support Indigenous organizations. That's the Indigenous Peyote Conservation. Is it initiative or institute, Sandor?
Initiative.
With that advice, I hope and I implore everyone today to spend the day thinking and centering indigeneity in the way that they live their life, and start that inner journey, like Matthew said, and just learn something and say it out loud. I love that. With that, I'll hand it off to the Microdose team to say goodbye.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We really appreciate your presence here today. Your insights are so highly valued by the Microdose team and everyone here watching. And I learned a lot, and I feel like this is something that I'm so honored to be a part of. So appreciate your time and have a wonderful day, however you choose to spend it.